There was a time when David Bromstad looked like the happiest man on HGTV. Bright tattoos, colorful shirts, wide smile, playful jokes, and that almost magical ability to walk into a house with a lottery winner and turn nervous excitement into pure television comfort. On My Lottery Dream Home, he was not just showing people kitchens, pools, bedrooms, and backyards. He was selling a feeling. The fantasy that one lucky ticket could erase years of pressure and open the door to a brand new life. But behind the camera, the man who helped other people choose their dream homes was quietly fighting a battle inside his own. And the irony was painful. David Bromstad, the host who made dreams look effortless, was watching his own dream collapse piece by piece. For years, viewers saw him as the colorful guide through other people's happy endings. He laughed with winners, hugged families, celebrated budgets that suddenly became bigger than anyone expected, and made every episode feel light. But fame has a strange way of freezing a person into one image. Once the public decides you're the joyful one, the funny one, the bright one, it becomes harder to admit when your life is dark. David had built an identity around color, creativity, and optimism. He had survived rejection, worked his way through design, won Design Star, became a face of HGTV, and eventually turned My Lottery Dream Home into one of the network's most recognizable comfort shows. But the same man who made strangers feel safe was not always safe inside himself. The deeper story began not with scandal in the usual Hollywood sense, but with a house. His own Florida home was supposed to be more than a property. It was a personal symbol, a childhood fantasy, a place where the designer could finally design for himself. After years of helping other people imagine what a better life might look like, David wanted a space that carried his own history, his own taste, his own healing. Then a devastating storm damaged the property, bringing water, mold, delays, and emotional destruction into what was supposed to be his sanctuary. Public reports and HGTV's own special later describe how the renovation turned into a 4-year emotional journey, and how the stress pushed him into unhealthy coping patterns. What made it heavier was that the house was not just wood, walls, and design choices. It represented something unfinished inside him. David has spoken about childhood pain, bullying, depression, and the feeling that this dream home somehow reflected the broken parts he had tried to cover with beauty. When the home broke, something in him broke too. The cameras did not immediately show that part. Viewers still saw the familiar David, charming, generous, upbeat, full of sparkle. But away from the polished rhythm of television, he was spiraling. He later admitted that he began using substances to cope, describing it as an escape during a period when the pressure became too much. And that is where the story changes. Because this was not simply a celebrity confession designed to shock people. It was the kind of truth that explained why some smiles look almost too bright. David was still working, still filming, still being the person audiences expected him to be. But privately, he knew he was in trouble. The dream home had become a mirror, and every delay, every repair, every sign of mold and damage seemed to reflect a deeper wound. At some point, the fantasy no longer helped him escape. It trapped him. He eventually paused the renovation and checked himself into treatment, choosing recovery over performance, honesty over the pressure to remain endlessly cheerful. For fans, this revelation changed the way they looked at him. Suddenly, the host of My Lottery Dream Home was not just the man helping winners spend money. He became the man who understood what it meant to win something on the outside while still feeling lost inside. His story became less about where he had disappeared and more about what he had survived quietly. And perhaps that is why the title David's Happy ending carried such emotional weight. It was not only about finishing a renovation. It was about rebuilding the person who had been hiding beneath the paint samples, the camera lights, and the laughter. David Bromstad did not vanish because he stopped caring. He stepped back because life forced him to confront the parts of himself that fame could not decorate. And when he returned with the truth, it was not perfect, polished, or easy. It was human. That is what really happened to David Bromstad. The dream home expert had to lose control of his own dream before he could finally begin building something real. But to understand why David Bromstad's private collapse felt so powerful, we have to go back to the image that made people love him in the first place. David did not enter television as a cold celebrity, protected by distance and mystery. He came across like someone who had fought hard just to become himself. Before HGTV turned him into a familiar face, he was an artist with a restless imagination, someone who loved color at a time when television design often preferred safe beige walls and predictable elegance. When he appeared on Design Star, he was different. He was bold, playful, emotional, and openly expressive in a way that made him impossible to ignore. He did not just decorate rooms. He told stories with color. He made design feel personal. That became his power, but it also became his burden. Because once audiences accepted him as the joyful designer, they expected him to stay that way forever. Every episode, every entrance, every laugh, every tattoo, every bright outfit reinforced the same public role. David Bromstad was the man who brought happiness into the room. And when you become a symbol of happiness, suffering can feel like betrayal. You start hiding pain, not because people demand it directly, but because you fear disappointing the version of you they believe in. That pressure became even more complicated when My Lottery Dream Home became a hit. The show was built on a fantasy almost everyone understands. A regular person buys a ticket, wins money, and suddenly the impossible becomes possible. David steps in as the guide, the celebrant, the friend who helps them choose the next chapter. It is simple television, but emotionally effective. People watch because they want to believe life can change overnight. They want to believe joy can arrive without warning. David's job was to make that fantasy feel warm instead of greedy, hopeful instead of vulgar. And he did it beautifully. He could walk beside a nervous winner and make the moment feel less overwhelming. He could joke about huge budgets without making people feel judged. He could notice the emotional meaning behind a bedroom, a pool, a kitchen island, a view. That was his gift. But while he was helping other people imagine fresh starts, his own fresh start was turning into a nightmare. His Florida home was supposed to be the reward after years of work. It was supposed to be the space where the public David and the private David could finally meet. Instead, the storm damage turned the home into a long, exhausting test. Repairs stretched on. Problems multiplied. The cost was not only financial. It was psychological. A house under renovation already tests patience, but a house tied to your deepest emotional needs can test identity itself. For David, the home was not just a project. It was proof that he had made it, that the creative child who once felt wounded could finally create a place of safety. So when that place became damaged, delayed, and contaminated, it attacked something far deeper than property value. It attacked the dream. And that is why his later confession mattered. He did not present himself as a victim of one dramatic incident. He revealed a slow erosion. First came stress, then came avoidance, then came substances used as a way to stop feeling the full weight of it. This is the part many people understand, even if their lives look completely different. Pain does not always arrive as one explosion. Sometimes it arrives as one more phone call, one more delay, one more repair bill, one more night of pretending everything is fine. David had a career built on transformation, yet he was trapped in a transformation he could not control. And in that contradiction, the public mask began to crack. What makes his story more haunting is that he did not lose his warmth on camera. That may be the most difficult part for fans to process. Many people assumed that if someone was struggling that badly, it would be obvious. But television does not work that way. Professionals perform. Hosts show up. They smile under lights. They deliver energy, even when they are empty. David continued to be the man viewers recognized, which meant his pain had to live in the spaces between filming, between public appearances, between the cheerful edits that made everything look seamless. That hidden distance between image and reality is where many celebrity stories become tragic. But David's story, at least in this chapter, moved toward confession instead of destruction. He eventually recognized that the coping mechanism had become its own danger. Checking into treatment was not a glamorous choice. It was not a television twist. It was a private admission that survival mattered more than pride. And when he later allowed this part of his journey to become public, he changed the meaning of his own brand. He was no longer only the colorful host of other people's luck. He was a man showing that luck does not cure trauma, money does not automatically create peace, and a beautiful house can still become unbearable if the person inside it is breaking. That is the deeper truth behind David Bromstad's recent story. It is not that fame ruined him, or that a storm alone destroyed him, or that one secret suddenly explained everything. It is that a lifetime of pressure, identity, childhood wounds, professional performance, and a damaged dream collided in one place. His house became the stage where all of it surfaced. And when he finally chose recovery, he was not just repairing walls. He was reclaiming the right to be more than the happy man on television. The most revealing part of David Bromstad's story is that his crisis did not erase his identity. It exposed the cost of maintaining it. For years, he had been the man who entered other people's lives at the exact moment everything seemed to change for the better. Lottery winners did not meet him in ordinary circumstances. They met him when their old limits had suddenly disappeared, when a dream budget replaced a survival budget, when a house was no longer just shelter but evidence that fate had finally smiled. David became the face of that emotional transition. He made sudden wealth look joyful, not frightening. He made big choices feel playful. But privately, he was facing a different kind of transition, one that money could not simplify. His own dream home had become a place of uncertainty, and uncertainty is dangerous for someone who has built a public life around possibility. The contradiction was almost cruel. On television, he stood inside finished spaces and helped people imagine future happiness. At home, he stood inside unfinished damage and wondered why happiness still felt out of reach. That contradiction forced him to confront something many successful people fear admitting. Achievement can decorate pain, but it cannot automatically heal it. The public saw tattoos, color, confidence, and charisma. Underneath that image was a person who had carried old wounds much longer than viewers knew. And when the house fell apart, it did not create those wounds from nothing. It gave them a room to echo in. That is why the renovation became more than construction. Every broken surface became symbolic. Every delay felt personal. Every repair seemed to ask whether he was actually building a sanctuary or just chasing an illusion. In shows like My Lottery Dream Home, the house is usually the happy ending. For David, the house became the beginning of a harder truth. A dream home cannot save you from yourself if the foundation inside you is still cracked. That realization is painful because it challenges the entire mythology of lifestyle television. These shows often teach viewers that transformation is visible. New floors, new furniture, new paint, new light. But David's journey suggested that the most important renovation is invisible. It happens in the parts of a person no camera can stage. When he entered treatment, it marked the moment he stopped trying to solve an internal crisis with external control. He could redesign rooms, select colors, imagine layouts, and turn damage into beauty. But recovery required a different kind of discipline. It required surrender. It required admitting that the persona who always brought joy also needed help. And for someone whose career depended on being emotionally available to others, that admission had enormous weight. Fans often talk about television personalities as if they belong to the audience, but they do not. They are people who perform a version of themselves for public consumption. David's version was unusually close to his real warmth, which made the performance even more exhausting. When the audience loves your light, you may begin to believe you have no permission to show your darkness. That is why his public honesty felt like a turning point. It did not destroy the David Bromstad image. It made it more honest. Suddenly, the bright colors were not evidence that life had always been easy. They became evidence of resistance. His joy looked less like innocence and more like a choice. And that is a far more powerful story. because anyone can appear happy when everything is working. It takes something deeper to choose color after damage, laughter after shame, openness after hiding. The special centered on his home was therefore not just HGTV content. It was a personal reckoning packaged through the language of renovation. Viewers could watch walls being repaired, rooms being restored, and design decisions being made, but the emotional center was the man trying to come back to himself. The question was not simply whether the house would be beautiful. The question was whether David could live inside it without being haunted by what it had represented. That is what made the title David's happy ending complicated. A happy ending, in this context, did not mean everything was fixed forever. It meant he had reached a place where he could stop running. It meant the home was no longer only a reminder of collapse, but a marker of survival. Still, his story should not be misunderstood as a neat redemption tale. Recovery is not a television episode with a clean final reveal. It is daily work, private accountability, and the humility to keep choosing health when the cameras are gone. David's courage was not in becoming perfect. It was in refusing to keep pretending. And perhaps that is why his story resonated beyond HGTV fans. Many people know what it feels like to build a life that looks good from the outside, while something inside remains unresolved. Many know the shame of coping badly, the fear of being exposed, the exhaustion of smiling through stress. David's story gave language to that contradiction. He reminded viewers that dream lives can still contain grief, and dream homes can still hold pain. But he also showed that collapse does not have to be the final chapter. Sometimes the real miracle is not winning the lottery, buying the house, or getting the show. Sometimes the miracle is waking up one day and choosing not to disappear inside the image everyone else expects you to maintain. What happened next was not a sudden comeback, but a slow return to ownership of his own life. David Bromstad's story became powerful because it did not follow the usual celebrity pattern of denial, exposure, apology, and disappearance. Instead, it unfolded through vulnerability. He did not need to be caught in a scandal to admit he had been struggling. He chose to speak about the pain, the coping, the treatment, and the long road back because silence had already taken too much from him. That choice matters. For someone whose career depends on being loved, confession can feel dangerous. The public is unpredictable. Some viewers respond with compassion, others with judgment, and others with the cold curiosity that turns private suffering into entertainment. But David's honesty changed the emotional contract between him and his audience. He was no longer simply the cheerful host guiding lottery winners through luxury homes. He became someone who had walked through a private storm and refused to let shame write the ending. The damaged home, once a symbol of stress and emotional collapse, began to transform into something more meaningful. It was no longer just a place where he lost control. It became the place where he learned what control could not fix. That distinction is important. Designers are trained to solve problems visually. A wall color can shift mood. A floor plan can improve movement. A room can be balanced, brightened, softened, or made dramatic. But human pain does not respond like a design flaw. You cannot repaint grief. You cannot install new lighting over trauma and call it healed. David had to learn that the most beautiful space in the world cannot become a home if the person inside it is still fighting himself. And that lesson gave his public image new depth. The tattoos, the colors, the humor, the warmth, all of it remained, but now it carried history. Viewers were no longer just seeing confidence. They were seeing someone who had survived the collapse behind that confidence. In many ways, this made him more relatable than ever. People do not connect only with perfection. They connect with recovery, with honesty, with the quiet courage of someone who admits that the dream nearly broke him. That is why his return did not feel like a publicity move. It felt like a man stepping back into the light with a different kind of truth. He could still celebrate other people's dream homes, but now the phrase meant something heavier. A dream home was not just about square footage, countertops, pools, or ocean views. It was about whether a person could feel safe inside the life they had built. David's experience exposed the emotional lie hidden inside many success stories. The belief that once you get the career, the money, the home, the recognition, the pain will automatically leave. But pain does not always obey success. Sometimes success gives pain a nicer room to sit in. That was the brutal lesson underneath his story. He had reached a level many people would envy, yet he still had to face old wounds, new stress, and the dangerous temptation to numb what could not be solved quickly. When he chose treatment, he was choosing something less glamorous than design and more important than fame. He was choosing survival without performance. And that choice is what allowed the story to move from darkness toward renewal. Still, renewal did not mean erasing the past. David's journey suggested that healing is not about pretending the collapse never happened. It is about learning how to live honestly after it does. The house remained part of the story, but its meaning changed. It was not a perfect fantasy anymore. It was a scar with walls, a repaired place that carried evidence of what had been endured. In that sense, the home became more honest than the original dream. Before the storm, it represented arrival. After the storm, it represented resilience. Before treatment, it may have felt like proof that he had failed to protect his own happiness. After recovery, it became proof that he could return to himself without hiding the damage. This is why audiences who followed his story saw more than a home renovation. They saw a man learning to separate his worth from the image he had built. David Bromstad did not have to be endlessly bright to be loved. He did not have to perform joy every second to deserve respect. He did not have to make everything look effortless to remain inspiring. In fact, the struggle made the inspiration more real. The man who helped lottery winners find their dream homes had finally admitted that a dream can become heavy when it carries too many unmet needs. And by facing that truth, he gave viewers something deeper than escapism. He gave them a reminder that rebuilding is not always beautiful at first. Sometimes it is messy, humiliating, slow, and full of setbacks. Sometimes the most important reveal is not a finished room, but a person who can stand in that room without needing to run away from himself. By the time David Bromstad began speaking openly about what he had gone through, the story no longer belonged only to HGTV or to one damaged house in Florida. It became a story about the dangerous distance between the life people see and the life a person is actually surviving. For years, David had been edited into comfort television, the smiling guide, the colorful designer, the man who could turn a lottery winner's shock into a charming house hunt. But real life does not move in clean episode arcs. There is no guaranteed reveal, no perfect final walkthrough, no music cue that proves everything is fixed. His journey showed that the most difficult rooms to renovate are the ones no one else can enter. The mind, the memory, the shame, the fear that success still has not made you whole. That was the hidden architecture of David's crisis. The storm damaged the home, but the deeper collapse came from what the home had carried emotionally. It had carried the promise that he was finally safe. It had carried the fantasy that after years of work, pain, and public performance, he could create a place that answered every old wound. But no house, no matter how beautiful, can carry that much weight forever. When the repairs dragged on and the dream became stressful, David was forced to see that the home had become a container for expectations no building could fulfill. And that realization was devastating. It meant the happy ending he had been chasing was not waiting behind a finished door. It had to be built inside himself. That is why treatment became such a turning point. It was the moment he stopped asking the house to heal him and began doing the harder work directly. For a man whose career had always been about visual transformation, this was a different kind of design challenge. There were no fabric swatches for sobriety, no paint samples for self-forgiveness, no dramatic before and after reveal that could summarize recovery. Recovery required honesty when no one was applauding. It required facing the patterns that had formed under pressure. It required understanding that coping is not the same as healing, and that escape only delays the pain until it returns louder. David's decision to enter treatment did not make him weaker in the eyes of many viewers. It made the old image of effortless happiness feel incomplete. Suddenly, fans could look back and realize that the smile had never been fake, but it had not been the whole story. That distinction matters. People often assume that if someone is struggling, their joy must be false. But human beings are more complicated than that. David could be genuinely warm, genuinely generous, genuinely funny, and still be hurting. He could love his work and still be exhausted by the role it required. He could help others dream while quietly losing faith in his own dream. This contradiction is exactly what made his story resonate. It refused to fit into a simple headline. He was not a fallen star. He was not a villain. He was not a man destroyed by fame. He was a person whose private pain finally demanded attention. And once he gave it attention, the story changed. The damaged home became not only a symbol of collapse, but a place of confrontation. It forced him to ask what kind of life he wanted when the cameras were not rolling. It forced him to question whether happiness meant keeping the performance alive or allowing himself to be seen without the performance. That is the real emotional center of what happened to David Bromstad. He did not simply repair a house. He renegotiated his relationship with the person the world thought it knew. For years, audiences had loved him because he brought lightness. After his confession, many loved him because he allowed darkness into the frame without letting it define him. And that is a very different kind of admiration. It is less about glamour and more about trust. Viewers could trust him more because he had stopped pretending the dream was simple. In a culture obsessed with luxury homes, celebrity lifestyles, and instant transformation, David's story quietly pushed back. It said that a beautiful home can still be lonely, a successful career can still be heavy, and a person who appears lucky can still need help. It also said something more hopeful. The truth does not always end a public life. Sometimes it deepens it. By revealing the struggle, David gave his audience permission to see him not as a mascot of happiness, but as a whole person. That may be the strongest version of his brand now. Not perfection, not endless sparkle, but survival with color still intact. The man who once helped lottery winners choose between dream kitchens and backyard pools had found himself facing a much more serious choice. Keep hiding inside the image, or step into recovery with the truth exposed. He chose the truth. And because of that, his story became larger than television. It became a reminder that sometimes the most valuable thing a person can win is not money, fame, or the perfect house. It is the chance to come back to life honestly, without pretending the storm never happened. What makes David Bromstad's journey so compelling is that it forces the audience to rethink what a dream life actually means. For years, his show was built around the fantasy of arrival. Someone wins the lottery, walks through beautiful homes, and chooses the place where their new life will begin. But David's own experience revealed a harder truth. Arrival is not the same as peace. You can arrive at fame, arrive at money, arrive at the house you always imagined, and still discover that something inside you remains unsettled. That is the part of his story that cuts deeper than the television narrative. He had the career, the recognition, the loyal fans, the creative freedom, and the dream home. Yet when the storm damaged that home and the renovation dragged into years of stress, it exposed a truth that no camera angle could soften. Success does not protect anyone from emotional collapse. In fact, success can make collapse harder to admit because people assume you have no right to suffer. They see the house, the show, the smile, and the lifestyle, then quietly decide that pain would be ungrateful. David's honesty challenged that cruel assumption. He showed that pain is not canceled by privilege, and healing is not automatic just because someone looks lucky. That is why his decision to speak openly mattered. He could have kept the story clean and limited it to a renovation special. He could have presented the damaged home as a simple design challenge, another before and after transformation with beautiful lighting and a triumphant final reveal. Instead, he allowed the emotional cost to become part of the story. That choice turned the house into a confession. Every restored wall carried the memory of what had nearly broken him. Every finished room became evidence that survival had required more than money and design skill. It required humility. It required treatment. It required the painful admission that he could not keep numbing the pressure and still call it living. For a public figure, that kind of admission can be terrifying. The entertainment world often rewards polish and punishes vulnerability. But David's vulnerability did not diminish him. It made him more human and in many ways more powerful. Because now, when viewers see him walking through homes with lottery winners, there is another layer beneath the charm. He understands that a house is never just a house. It is hope, fear, memory, identity, and sometimes escape. He understands that people are not only buying bedrooms and countertops. They're trying to imagine who they might become once their life changes. And because he has seen how a dream can become heavy, he can bring a deeper compassion to those moments. His story also reminds us that recovery does not have to erase personality. David did not become less colorful because he admitted his pain. He did not lose his humor because he chose sobriety. He did not stop being the expressive, tattooed, joyful designer people recognized. Instead, those qualities became richer. His color no longer looked like decoration alone. It looked like defiance. His laughter no longer seemed like effortless brightness. It seemed like something he had fought to protect. That is the emotional transformation behind the public one. The old David was lovable because he made dreams feel possible. The newer David feels more meaningful because he knows dreams can also be fragile. He knows a happy ending is not handed to you just because the house is finished. It has to be maintained like recovery itself. And that is why the phrase, "what really happened," cannot be answered with one scandal, one rumor, or one dramatic disappearance. What really happened is slower and more human. A man who built a career around helping others find dream homes had to face the damage inside his own dream. A television host known for joy had to admit that joy alone could not save him. A designer who understood beauty had to learn that beauty without honesty can become another hiding place. And a person loved for his light had to stop being afraid of showing the shadow behind it. That is the real story, not a fall from grace, but a confrontation with reality. Not a destroyed career, but a painful recalibration of identity. Not an ending, but a return with fewer illusions. David Bromstad's journey matters because it does not sell the fantasy that everything becomes perfect after recovery. It offers something better, the possibility of living truthfully after the fantasy breaks. His home may have been damaged by a storm, but the deeper storm was internal. And when he chose to face it, he proved that rebuilding is not about making life look untouched. It is about accepting the cracks, repairing what can be repaired, and refusing to let shame decide who you become next. In the end, David Bromstad's story is not really about a television host vanishing from the spotlight, because he never truly disappeared. It is about something more painful and more honest. A man who is visible to millions, yet privately unreachable even to himself. That is the strange loneliness of public happiness. People can know your face, repeat your catchphrases, recognize your tattoos, admire your energy, and still have no idea what happens when the door closes and the performance ends. David's journey pulled back that curtain. It showed that the person who brings joy into other people's homes can still be searching for peace in his own. And that is why his story lands with such emotional force. The host of My Lottery Dream Home built a career around the idea that life can change suddenly, beautifully, almost magically. But his own transformation did not come from a winning ticket or a perfect property. It came from damage, confession, treatment, and the willingness to rebuild without pretending the storm had never happened. That is a much harder kind of happy ending, but also a more believable one. The dream home was once supposed to prove that he had arrived. After everything he endured, it became proof that arrival means very little if you are not well enough to live inside the life you created. For David, the finished house mattered, but the deeper victory was learning not to hide inside it. He had to stop using beauty as armor. He had to stop letting the cheerful version of himself silence the wounded version. He had to accept that being loved by an audience is not the same as being healed. That realization changed the entire meaning of his public image. The bright colors remained, the humor remained, the warmth remained, but now they carried truth instead of pressure. David Bromstad did not need to be a perfect symbol of joy anymore. He could be joyful and wounded, successful and recovering, grateful and honest about pain. That complexity made him more real than the polished fantasy ever could. And perhaps that is the lesson viewers were never expecting from a show about lottery winners and dream homes. The biggest prize is not always a mansion, a pool, a view, or a room designed exactly the way you imagined. Sometimes the biggest prize is the courage to admit that the dream you chased did not save you, and then to keep living anyway. David's story reminds us that people are not rescued by appearances. They are rescued by truth, support, accountability, and the decision to stop running from themselves. His storm was physical, yes, but it also became emotional and spiritual. It damaged walls, but it also exposed what had been hidden behind them. And once that hidden pain came into the light, the rebuilding could finally become real. That is what really happened to David Bromstad. He was not simply broken by a house, a storm, or fame. He was forced into a confrontation with the parts of himself that success had not healed. He faced the danger of numbing his pain. He entered treatment. He returned with honesty. And in doing so, he turned a private collapse into a public reminder that even the brightest people can be fighting battles no one sees. The tragedy is not that David struggled. The tragedy would have been if he had continued pretending until there was nothing left of him. Instead, he chose a different ending. Not a perfect ending, not a clean television ending, but a human one. He chose to survive with his truth intact. He chose to rebuild both the house and the man inside it. And now, when he walks into another dream home with another lottery winner, the moment feels different. Behind the smile is someone who understands that dreams can be complicated. Behind the laughter is someone who knows that luck is not the same as peace. Behind the color is someone who has seen darkness and still chose not to live there. That is why David Bromstad's story is not just sad. It is quietly powerful. It shows that healing does not always look like a dramatic comeback. Sometimes it looks like staying honest, staying sober, staying present, and allowing yourself to be seen without the costume of perfection. The world first knew David as the man who helped others find their happy ending. But after everything he went through, perhaps his real gift is showing that a happy ending is not a place you buy. It is a life you keep choosing, even after the dream falls apart.